Odin Sphere is a game I came across while searching for good JRPGs for the PlayStation 2, which is odd since it isn't a JRPG. I mean, I guess you could say it technically is, since it's a Japanese game with RPG elements, but by that logic Resident Evil 4 is a JRPG, and at that point you'd be using the label so broadly as to make it meaningless. So no, I don't think Odin Sphere is a JRPG. I heard about it because it was on a list of supposedly good JRPGs for the PS2 though, which just goes to show you can't trust everything you read on the internet. While Odin Sphere is not a JRPG, it's a little hard to pin down exactly what it is. In terms of gameplay, it's a side-scrolling action game with RPG elements, but looking at it as a whole, I'd say it would be more accurate to describe it as an interactive fairy tale, and not a fluffy, Disney-like fairy tale, an older, grimmer kind of fairy tale. One that is mostly whimsical and upbeat, and doesn't pull any punches when it comes to the more tragic or ominous parts of the story. The game takes place in the fictional world of Arion, and is divided into 5 stories, each one following the journey of a different character. Each story sheds new light on the world and the overall plot, and events in one story will often be referenced in or have a direct impact on the events of the other stories. The 5 stories are respectively about Gwendolen, a Valkyrie serving King Odin who longs for her father's love and approval, Cornelius, the prince of Titania who has been stricken with Apuka's curse and is trying to find a way to return to his human form, Mercedes, the fairy princess who must come to terms with the responsibility that comes with being royalty, Oswald, the Shadow Knight who is trying to find meaning to his life, and Velvet, the princess of the extinct kingdom of Valentine who is attempting to prevent the end of the world that is foretold in various prophecies and psalms. Each story brings new perspectives and new information to the table, and together they form a compelling interwoven tapestry of events and character moments. The story is really good, and it is nice to experience a narrative that has clearly had a lot of thought and care put into it. One thing I really appreciate about the story is that it almost never resorts to exposition dumps. Just about everything you learn about the world is discovered organically simply by experiencing the story and following the characters on their journeys. In short, the game does an excellent job of world building, and has a solid understanding of the show don't tell rule. But while the story of Odin Sphere is good and is worth experiencing, it does have some shortcomings. The first is an issue that ties into a problem I have with the gameplay that I'll go into more detail about later. Namely, the game reuses a lot of content in each story, including the bosses. A lot of the bosses are faced multiple times across the different stories, though each time is for a different story reason. For some of the boss characters, fighting them multiple times makes sense. In the case of the dragon Belial, he's been magically enslaved by a sorcerer, so it makes sense that you fight him multiple times, as he has no choice but to keep following orders. Another good example is Lord Brigand. He is powerful and cunning, but he's also a rather short-sighted oaf, and it makes sense that he would constantly get into fights, and thus why you would have to face him several times across the 5 stories. But there are other characters where it makes no sense for them to have so many boss battles. For instance, the dragon Wagner and the demon lord Odin are both presented as being incredibly old, intimidating, and powerful, yet they are fought and defeated numerous times throughout the stories, to the point where it undermines the supposed threat they're meant to pose. It also doesn't help that the reasons for some of the battles feel incredibly contrived and flimsy, making it obvious that the game is just looking for excuses to reuse the bosses. But by far the worst offender is Odette, the Queen of the Netherworld. She is fought and defeated so often it makes you wonder how anyone stays dead when it doesn't seem that hard to fight and sneak your way out of the Netherworld. She was the final boss in the first story, and personally I think that should have been the only time when she's fought. The other times she's fought should have been replaced with her summoning servants to fight on her behalf, as that would be more fitting for a powerful being like her, and it would have made the one time you actually do fight her more impactful and memorable. When it comes to the merits of each individual story, I think overall they're pretty good, and each one finds a good balance of being a good self-contained narrative while also contributing to the overarching plot. But some of the stories are better than others, and ironically I think the first and fifth stories are the weakest. One issue I have with the first story is that initially it appears to have some gaping plot holes that render the plot utterly nonsensical. However, once you complete the fourth story, you'll realize that there actually weren't gaping plot holes in the first story, there was just a lot of crucial information that the game fails to tell you, making it look like there are gaping plot holes. I understand that you're not supposed to see the whole picture from any one story, but each story should still make sense on its own, and the first story fails in this regard. Another issue I have concerns the main character, Gwendolen. Throughout the game, there are several characters whose motivations aren't entirely clear, and whose actions are a bit inconsistent. For the most part, it's pretty minor and ignorable, but with Gwendolen, it's neither. The story establishes quite clearly that Gwendolen's driving motivation is to earn her father's love and respect. So overpowering is this desire that she is willing to die or commit treason if she thinks it will make her father happy. And yet, she completely drops her devotion to her father as soon as it's convenient for the plot. I get what they were going for, as the story is about Gwendolen letting go of her need to please her father and learning to live for herself, but the game didn't execute it very well. You can't establish a character as having one thing being incredibly important to them and then have them suddenly drop it without warning or explanation. It also doesn't help that I didn't like Gwendolyn's voice actress very much. The voice acting in the game is for the most part excellent, and most of the voice actors do a great job of bringing their respective characters to life. But there are a few voice actors who are not quite as good as the others. And while Gwendolyn's voice actress wasn't terrible, I was constantly aware that I was listening to an actor reading lines, and not to the character speaking. The fifth story is thankfully free of major plot holes or drastic character reversals, but it has problems of its own. The first 4 stories focus on the arc of their respective main characters, while the 5th story feels less like a cohesive arc and more like a vehicle for answering any questions that were left unanswered by the first 4 stories. Consequently, it feels a bit unfocused. And while the respective climaxes of the first 4 stories each felt epic and appropriate, the climax in the 5th story feels rather random. One last issue I have with the narrative as a whole concerns the ending. I'll try to keep my criticisms as vague and spoiler-free as possible, but there may be some minor spoilers, so keep that in mind. After you complete the first 5 stories, a 6th one unlocks, and in this final story, everything that has been built up in the first 5 stories comes to a head in a grand finale. The ending is pretty good, and it is quite epic and tragic, but it feels a bit off to me. Without spoiling, let's just say that something happens, and while this something was hinted at and foreshadowed from the very first story, it doesn't feel like a natural progression from what happened in the first 5 stories. It rather feels like events are just kind of happening so that the story can have the grand and tragic ending at once. A good example of this concerns a large cauldron that is a key part of the narrative. Throughout the first 5 stories, it's made quite clear that a magic ring called Tetrel is needed in order to control the cauldron. So crucial is this plot point that retrieving the ring is an important part of several of the stories. And yet, during the ending, a character is able to take control of the cauldron despite the fact that they don't have the ring Tetrel. One could argue that this particular character didn't need the ring because of spoilers, but this is undermined by the fact that he was also trying to obtain the ring, indicating that he also needed the ring in order to control the cauldron. This is one of several instances where the events leading up to the ending feel contrived rather than naturally built up to. It's not that the ending doesn't make sense or that it happens out of nowhere, but it doesn't feel entirely earned. For a good example of a story with a similar ending, I'd recommend Attack on Titan. Without spoiling, let's just say that Attack on Titan has a very similar ending, but it feels completely natural and earned in a way that Odin Sphere's ending just isn't. Another problem with the ending is the multiple possible endings. Which ending you get is determined by the choices you make in the 6th story. There are 5 final bosses, and you get to choose which character fights which boss. But while there are some unique scenes and character moments you can unlock depending on which characters you choose, there are only 2 endings, a good ending and a bad ending. In order to get the good ending, you have to choose one particular order of the characters and the bosses they face. Choosing any other order will give you the bad ending. It's disappointing, as I think it would have been more organic and more interesting if there were several different possible endings that reflected the choices you made. You could still have the best ending reserved for the game's preferred order of the characters, but it would have been nice if the game had more variety in the ending instead of just shunting anyone who didn't make the correct choices into the bad ending. Now let me be clear, the story and ending of Odin Sphere are not bad. On the contrary, they're really, really good. And there's a depth and creativity to the world and characters that you don't see very often. I just think that there was room for improvement, and my overly analytical brain can't help but narrow in on the flaws and things I like and try to think of ways to improve it. In fact, the more I like something, the more critical I'll be, since I find it interesting to think of how something that's good could have been even better. If I don't like something, I usually won't care enough to examine it so closely, but I do like Odin Sphere, so I do care. The story and the characters are the strongest aspects of the game, though I'd say the visuals and art style are also great. This game is absolutely gorgeous, and by choosing excellent 2D artwork instead of PS2-era 3D graphics, the game has a timeless appearance that still looks good even more than a decade later. The music is also really excellent, and between the visual and auditory feast this game provides, I'd say it's an artistic masterpiece. But then there's the gameplay, which really is the weakest part of the game. Not because it's bad, but because it's repetitive. Really, really repetitive. Like I said before, the game is a side-scrolling action game with RPG elements. You go to the various levels based on different regions of Arion, where you fight enemies using the game's core combat system. You enter an arena, kill all the enemies, collect the items that are left behind upon your victory, and you go to the next arena where you do the same thing. Rinse and repeat until you eventually reach a boss at the end, which you fight and defeat. You then go back to a town or home base where you can restock on supplies, reorganize your inventory, and talk to various side characters who will give you hints or notable facts about the world. Then you go to the next level and do the same thing again. There are a few other elements to the gameplay besides just killing enemies. When enemies die, they leave behind phosons, little balls of energy that have multiple uses. You can absorb them directly with your weapon, which will replenish your cipher meter, enabling you to pull off a number of different techniques that can help you in battle. Alternatively, you can plant seeds into the ground, which will automatically absorb any nearby phozons. If they absorb enough phozons, they will sprout into a fruit, vegetable, or sheep that can be collected and used to replenish health and gain experience points. There's also a wide variety of alchemical concoctions you can create using the items you collect. The primary items you need are an empty flask and a mandrake. The mandrakes are a variety of species of magical plants found throughout Arion, and can be obtained by listening for their telltale squeaks and jumping on the spot they're hiding in. Each type of mandrake has different properties and uses, and you can collect scrolls and manuscripts that will give you detailed instructions on how to make certain potions. The core combat is pretty fun, and the act of collecting and creating new items as you go is interesting and fun at first, but the item system can get pretty tedious after a while, especially if you like to organize and micromanage your inventory. But the biggest problem with the gameplay is that it's identical in every story. For every narrative, the core gameplay loop is the same. Each character has a slightly different playstyle, but aside from that, the only difference between each story is the order in which you play the levels and the story reason for going to the levels. The level design is so basic that it's incredibly easy to tweak things slightly and then pretend that it's a different level despite being virtually the same. So much is reused between all the stories, and the game is incredibly efficient, bordering on lazy with how it uses its content. The bosses are a highlight of the gameplay, as each one is tough and memorable, requires thought and skill to overcome, and manages to be the right kind of frustrating, the kind that makes you determined to win rather than the kind that just makes you want to give up in disgust. But even these highlights are spoiled slightly by the fact that the game reuses the bosses as much as everything else throughout the 5 stories. Even 2 of the final bosses are repeats of bosses from the initial 5 stories. It seems to me that the creators prioritized the story over the gameplay. It's clear that they had a story they wanted to tell, and in order to ensure that they were able to tell the whole story, they kept the design of the gameplay as simple and basic as possible, making it easy to reuse content between stories, and ensuring that they wouldn't be forced to cut any of the story due to constraints or limits placed on them by the gameplay or level design. In a way, their dedication to their vision is admirable, but it does leave the gameplay feeling distinctly stale by the time you're finished with the game. I don't know what the exact solution would be, but there are some ways that could have helped disguise or mitigate the game's repetitiveness. Streamlining some of the more tedious aspects of the item collecting and offering a bit more variety when it comes to the bosses would both have been a good place to start. Perhaps a roguelike element to the levels would also have helped give it more variety, as it's got just about the perfect setup for such a system. As it stands, the excellent art direction and compelling storylines do make up for the repetitiveness of the gameplay. But if those 2 things were taken away, the gameplay would absolutely not be able to stand up on its own merits. So does this mean this is the kind of game where the gameplay is just a tedious chore that gets in the way of the story, and you'd be better off just watching the cutscenes on YouTube? Well, not exactly. While the gameplay is repetitive, it's not bad. And there are lots of touches and details of the gameplay that do tie into the narrative and contribute to the world building. The unique designs and quirks of the enemies you encounter in each region do give you a greater sense that this is a living, breathing world, as do the various characters you can talk to in between levels. The Puka village, though a bit small, also adds to the world building every time you visit it. Even the phozon mechanic does tie into the larger narrative and themes of the game, and it is a neat example of story being expressed through gameplay. Odin Sphere is not a perfect game, far from it. But it is a very good one. Its strengths ultimately do outweigh its shortcomings, and it's a unique experience that deserves to be played. While I do have issues with it, in the end I did quite like Odin Sphere, and I would highly recommend you play it if you haven't already. Though I've heard that there's an enhanced remake that is better, so you may want to check that version out, and I will definitely be trying the remake at some point as well. My final score for Odin Sphere is a 7 out of 10. So what do you think? Have you played Odin Sphere? Did you like it? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.